The knives have come out for Premier Jason Kenney in Alberta. United Conservative Party members will vote on the fate of Kenney's leadership in his time as Premier on April 9th. We'll get the inside scoop on what is really going on in Alberta. I'm Candice Malcolm, and this is The Candice Malcolm Show. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning into the program. So a lot of people ask me, I get a lot of emails and just friends asking me like, hey, Candice, what is going on in Alberta? What's going on with Premier Jason Kenney? Is he going to survive all this? And I thought it would be good to dedicate an episode of the show to sort of doing a deeper dive and trying to figure out what happened in Alberta, how we got to where we are, and what is at stake, what is going to happen to the Premier over there. So to do that, I am bringing in my friend Brad Tennant. Brad is the Vice President and Alberta lead of Wellington Advocacy, a national public affairs firm, and he is based out of Calgary. Previously, Brad served as the Executive Director of the United Conservative Party and was a senior member of Jason Kenney's leadership campaigns. So Brad, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me, Candice.
Okay, so, there's really like a lot of drama going on in Alberta. If you read the headlines in legacy media, they sort of make it seem like Kenney's days are numbered, but we know that Kenney is a very resilient politician and he has beat the odds many, many times in his political career. So why don't we just start, Brad, by talking a little bit about what is going on in Alberta politics in a nutshell, what's happened in the last year, what is driving this whole leadership review process?
Yeah, well, I think it comes a lot out of what you were just saying, but there's no shortage of drama in Alberta, and I think it's honestly been that way for more than a year. It's almost been that way since Ralph Klein kind of left politics. Alberta has seen a path of one-term premiers ever since. It's seen kind of disruption in the conservative movement. And I think, after almost 2 decades of that chaos, we're kind of getting to, a conservative movement. I would say less so a conservative voter base and a conservative member base, but a conservative movement that is almost so focused on infighting that the first instinct when things get tough go towards infighting. And I think in the last year, there's been, COVID policy, I think, has been unpopular in Alberta, more so in Alberta than probably other parts of the country. That being said, Alberta's faced less lockdowns, less measures, but that's almost aggravated those on the political left and those in the mainstream media even more. And at the same time, left some on the kind of conservative side a little bit disenchanted, not liking the last series of lockdown, not liking some of the measures that came with it. So that's led to a political environment that, like we said, is quite dramatic here in Alberta. But again, like you said, I don't think it's anything that Premier Kenney's not used to. Premier Kenney's been an effective conservative politician ever since he entered the arena almost 3 decades ago. He has always been counted out by kind of the mainstream media, elitist pundits, people that have not expected him to do something. And I think those people are already calling the cards that, Kenney isn't going to be successful in the months ahead. But when you talk to people on the ground here and you talk to ordinary United Conservative members and, a little bit more of the activists at the ground level, I think that a lot of people understand Premier Kenney was dealt a very tough hand in the last couple of years. And coming out of it, there's really no better place to be than Alberta. We have a balanced budget for the first time, really, and you can go back and debate this, but a balanced budget leading into a balanced budget probably for the first time since those Ralph Klein days. And, the economy is booming. Oil and gas is back up. It's not just oil and gas. A bunch of other industries and commodity industries are firing on all cylinders. So, there's no better place to be than Alberta for a lot of Albertans. I think there's renewed hope and optimism, which is a lot of what Jason Kenney got elected on. But obviously COVID threw a wrench in that. But coming out of that, I think, there is a sense of optimism that I don't think really shines through the mainstream media a lot of the times here in the province,
Well, it's certainly one of those things where no one was happy in Alberta with the COVID stuff. As you alluded to, the left wanted the Premier to go so much further and lock down harder and follow some of the more draconian measures that were taken. I'm not saying that there weren't draconian measures in Alberta. There certainly were. And a lot of them, I would be right there in line with people criticizing the Premier, saying, why did you do this? Why did you do that? Unnecessary. However, I think that people on the right were also have a very, very low tolerance for a lot of the COVID measures. And because of that, the Premier wasn't pleasing anybody, because the more conservative people in the province didn't want to have vaccine mandates. They didn't want the extra lockdown. So it was hard for him to please either side. Let's talk a little bit about this leadership review. Where did this come from? Why is it happening? And can you kind of walk us through what that's going to look like?
Yeah, so there is typically a leadership review. Federally, this doesn't happen after you win a majority government. In both legacy provincial parties, there is a leadership review, even if you win a majority government. The legacy parties being the PC party and the Wild Rose. And they tend to have a lot of buildup. They tend to have a lot of a lot of mystique and a lot of media buildup around them, because there is an opportunity for members to essentially vote down their leader. And at that point, the leader has been the premier of the province in all but the Wild Rose cases. Personally, I think the first convention I went to was the Ralph Klein one, where they were actually voted down. Since then, I've, being a political activist here, I would have attended or observed the Alison Redford, the Ed Stelmach, the Danielle Smith, the Brian Jean, all the kind of leadership reviews that followed. Having been through these, like they're somewhat regular here. They have a lot of drama here, but I can tell why people in other provinces and other jurisdictions, might find them as sometimes peculiar, because they are a unique opportunity. I think Saskatchewan has a semi-regular at their AGM's process of doing this, but it is something that's somewhat at least unique to Alberta politics. That being said, in the lead up, obviously, this is kind of where Ralph Klein lost. It's also where Ed Stelmach and Alison Redford both kind of got second wins in their premierships. Like both were unpopular for their own reasons, facing challenges in the lead up. I think both kind of surprised with getting their 77%. And they both, were able to get some extra wind in their sails. So they've been a unique thing, I think, defining conservative premierships. And on the Wild Rose side, I think Danielle got 90% in one of hers and still obviously didn't carry on to the next election. And Brian Jean, if I recall, got 78% or 77% rounded up, and didn't carry on to the next election. So, these things have been quite dramatic. And, I think leaders have passed them more often than not. But they've kind of fueled this cycle in Alberta that, keeps, I think, political leaders focused a lot on the kind of internal workings of the party.
Well, it's a great reminder of why you're there and who you represent. I think that a lot of the critique that comes to conservative leaders in Canada is, the saying in Canadian federal politics is that politicians get auto-washed, right? They move to Ottawa and they start representing the people around them, the bureaucracy, the media, the sort of left-wing society in Ottawa, and they forget about the people maybe that sent them there. So it's a great way to connect with the authentic grassroots base of the party and to make sure that you're governing for them. So it serves a useful purpose. But let's talk about a little bit of the drama that happened with regards to the convention, because there was supposed to be an in-person review on April 9th in Red Deer. And there was a membership cutoff that happened on March 19th. So after that, they were no longer able to purchase memberships. And then it was determined on March 23rd, so 4 days after the membership cutoff, that the review was going to be switched from in-person to a mail-in ballot system, which obviously got a lot of people worried, concerned, a lot of accusations that something foul was happening. Can you sort of walk us through that decision-making process? Why did it switch from a in-person vote to a mail-in vote?
Yeah, so I think the first switch, you got to go back to, I think late last fall. Some individuals, particularly, it was more some unhappy folks in the backbench, were speaking up and wanting a leadership review quicker. This leadership review was originally supposed to be at the AGM happening this fall in Edmonton. I'm not sure if they've got that date scheduled. It usually happens around October and November. So the leadership was going to be decided by delegates, as was traditional through those previous leadership races I discussed. But, there was some desire to have this out there. Premier Kenney said himself, he welcomes it, and he's always kind of happy to have that grassroots feedback on his premiership. So he actually moved it up to an SGM, to a special vote. Traditionally, these leadership reviews are done at an AGM. And then, I think that they ran into an issue quite quickly. There was first a number of unhappy people that they weren't able to make it there for that single 6-hour slot to join in Red Deer. And people kind of forget Alberta's a province that's larger than most countries, and some people were looking at even living in some urban areas like Grand Prairie, where you were having to travel 6-7 hours. You can name the other spot on the map. There was quite a bit of travel that occurred for a lot of people. So I think some were unhappy with it being in one location. It was obviously costing individuals $100 to go for paying for the registration and the fees that usually go with an SGM. So I do feel for the party board, as they were kind of hurt on that angle, and that there were people already unhappy. And then obviously, and I've managed these AGMs before, so I've got a lot of sympathy for them. But even in Red Deer, at the exact location we were having it, we've had AGMs before there, and we had 2,000 people. And in all honesty, you can't get parking within 4 or 5 city blocks. It's a big mess, and that's with 2,000 people. And I think they saw more interest in this leadership than they expected. Obviously, I believe at the end of it, there was something like 14,000 signups.
Yeah, there was a global report that said 13,700 people had registered to vote, which just to me, thinking about the logistics of that, to your point about finding parking, it's like managing a crowd of that size is not something that a group of volunteers or a political party is really used to, unless you're talking about maybe a Donald Trump rally or something like that. But that's not something that we're used to here in Canada.
Yeah, no, and it would have been logistically, the amount of volunteer staff you would have had. Again, it's just like, it was fundamentally unserious. And I think it would have swelled quite a bit because members still could buy delegate passes after that date. So I think it would have swelled to north of 20,000. And I think that would still be a fairly conservative estimate. So, all that being said, you're not going to fit that group into a hotel ballroom. I respect the party volunteer board because they do have to make some tough decisions. And here, like if they would have went through with Red Deer, it would have been a logistical nightmare, and everybody would have been crying foul that day, the next day, and crying, if Kenney were to win it, the issue would have been that it was unfair and you couldn't get in there and everything of the sort. So I think the party, made this situation was pretty unprecedented. What they did is they opened it to the maximum amount of voters, the maximum amount of members. It's now, so if you have a UCP party membership, you can vote. You will be getting a ballot package. Fundamentally, it's the most democratic and open way to do it. But Alberta does have like a hyper online culture that there are people that will complain about something no matter what. Those people kind of have done that. And there is, this isn't the Wild Rose Party. Both of our leadership elections, I came from the Wild Rose side personally. Both of our leadership elections were done through the mail. Every federal leadership has been done through the mail. It's an audited process with an independent auditor. I can't help but think there's a group that would cry no matter how the process goes if they lose. And, that being said, I think this is probably the best way to do it given a hard situation. And I've got to sympathize with the board as, the town criers kind of kept their voice very loud after the decision,
Well, it's very much one of those, like the analogy that the squeaky wheel gets the grease. It's like we hear a lot from the people who oppose the premier. We hear a lot from Jason Kenney's opposition. And it is hard to sort of speculate and quantify, like, what percentage of the party does it represent? Is it 10%? Is it 20? Is it 50? Like it's hard to gauge. And to your point about the online culture, it's like the same thing with the comment sections. The people who sometimes are the loudest on the comment boards are the ones that have the more extreme positions on the issues. They don't necessarily represent the medium or the everyday person. So let's talk a little bit about who is driving this revolt. Who are Kenney's main opposition, and in your view, your estimation as being sort of a grassroots conservative in Alberta, how large is it? How much of the party does it represent?
Yeah, no, I think I think that there is a group there that hasn't been happy, obviously, and I think it's been that way since the United Conservative Party was formed. I do think, like where you were mentioning at the start, Alberta does tend to have a little bit of that, but Albertans also, like, they're very involved. Like, it's a community where you get the most volunteers, you have the highest average per capita charitable donation. Like, it is a province that people are involved in their community, people are involved in their politics and stuff like that. So I do think that there's a much quieter part of the party's membership and the party support base who just want to see politics done the right way and see things effectively move forward. So, well, like you say, the squeaky wheel does sometimes get the grease, but, I think in Alberta, what still will drive this party and what will drive this membership and this leadership out will be the more, common everyday conservative, which is a good process in this. As far as what's driving the opposition, I think that there is, and it was no easy process to unite two conservative parties that actually did not like each other at all. Like, there was a point, I could tell you, even from my point, as a former Wild Roser, I did not like the idea. I think a lot of people came together. Not everybody did. So there's still a little bit of, former rivalries that I think drive a little bit of it. Obviously a lot of this, I wouldn't say a lot of this, but one of the lead proponents in it's Brian Jean, who I think is still bitter about losing the last leadership election and the last time members had their say. There is some caucus members speaking out who might be unhappy about something else one way or another, whether that's not getting into cabinet or not being in a certain role, or something leadership's not seeing things their way, and they're balancing that back with talking about being unhappy with the leader, unhappy with the process. This typically happens in politics. Even in Saskatchewan, Ontario, other conservative governments, they've seen some backbenchers kicked out and stuff like that in the last couple of years. Kenney's almost allowed for more of this kind of backbench speaking up. And I think that there's like a Puritan conservative in all of us that likes allowing for more dissent in the party. But because Kenney's kind of allowed it, I think there's been a more vocal opposition to him. And to answer your question more fully, I think there's some people bitter about them not being in leadership, and some people, just genuinely who aren't happy with the direction of the party that are kind of driving this.
Well, it's a kind of almost confusing from an outsider perspective, because Jason Kenney didn't come from either camp, really. He was a federal conservative. He represented Calgary, but he was, an MP in Ottawa. So he wasn't really part of the conservative fracture in Alberta between the Wild Rose and the PCs. And it's interesting because, I know that he has a lot of support from Wild Rose people, former Wild Rose people working in his office. And it's not an immediate like, oh, Jason Kenney came from the PC side or the Wild Rose side. That was why he was sort of the perfect person to merge the party, because he didn't have baggage on either side. But it's interesting because the opposition to him seems to come from sort of the more rural MLAs and people who are really unhappy with the vaccine mandates and the lockdowns. And yet the sort of main person that's coming out against him, Brian Jean, seems to me, I know that he has the endorsement of Peter MacKay, a very prominent sort of red Tory in the left sort of flank of the federal conservatives. And when Brian Jean was asked, what would you do differently if you were running the province, he said that he would have invited the NDP opposition leader, Rachel Notley, to be part of cabinet, which, for all of the critiques that you might have about how Premier Kenney governed over the last 2 years, not including Rachel Notley in the decision-making seemed like a really strange opposition. So it seems hard to really understand from an outside perspective whether the opposition is coming from the left or the right, whether it's coming from the Wild Rose camp or the PC camp, or whether it's just, I know that there was I wanted to ask you about this leaked audio of Premier Kenney sort of saying that, a lot of this is just people that are personally bitter that they didn't get a portfolio or they didn't get a position that they wanted, their company's not getting government contracts. He also characterized his opponents as being hateful bigots, which I'm sorry to say sounds a bit like what Justin Trudeau would say. But maybe you could help explain that, help us understand that.
Well, yeah, I wouldn't, I think that, we all have had conversations before where, somebody else can take it and blow it up. I think, look, Jason, was one of the most out of all of Canadian politics and all of Canadian punditry and media, Jason was one of the most aggressive defenders of kind of the truckers' rights during that time. He's been one of the biggest counterweights to Justin Trudeau. I can only imagine how big of a mess we'd be in the last couple of years if the kind of Notley-Trudeau alliance had continued over that time. So, Jason has been, I think, one of the more vocal opponents of the kind of Trudeau era and the Trudeau kind of, comments and everything around that. But largely, I think that it's a unique spot. I don't think it's an ideological driven opposition to Premier Kenney, quite frankly. I think Jason Kenney, and I understand, I sympathize with a lot of the people that have frustrations about the COVID policies of the last couple of years, because I was certainly there at points too. But Jason has been one of the more effective conservatives, not just in Alberta, but nationally in the last 20, 30 years. He was one of the most trusted individuals within the Stephen Harper government. He is a genuine, works 20 hours a day conservative, which in my opinion is what Alberta kind of needs to push forward right now. His opposition comes from a lot of bitterness, which, and I was lucky to be executive director of the party. I've been lucky to be involved in kind of party politics, and I genuinely love the people that donate, the people that support this party are kind of your ordinary, hardworking, not overly political Albertans. And it almost the process, especially I would think since Ralph has left, political partisans have been so obsessed with infighting and everything along that end within this province that I think it's hurt our ability to do what I think ordinary conservative voters and supporters want us to do. And I think Premier Kenney's falling a little bit victim to that, because it is, campaign more driven by bitterness. Brian Jean, he's an individual who's, when he was leader, he said he would support some form or his own form of a carbon tax. Like you were saying, I can't imagine that. If you asked any Alberta conservative what they should have done differently over COVID, I think Brian Jean's the only one who would call himself conservative and say the first thing he'll say is we should have let Rachel Notley into cabinet. Because I think that there's, natural reasons for conservatives to be unhappy, but it hasn't been what I think has been driving a lot of the opposition to Kenney. I would also say, and this is pretty unique, but obviously we balance the budget here, and despite what Justin says, budgets don't balance themselves. And a lot of the opposition to Kenney even came from some in the conservative rank and file when he was holding the line on public spending early in his term. A lot of people thought that there were public servants that, they weren't getting the raise they want. And some from even rural MLA backgrounds were attacking him for not spending enough money and not spending it on these issues. He held the line. Today we have a balanced budget. So, getting back to your main question here, I don't think it's really a kind of conservative thing. I think, I love this party, I love this movement, but we've had a lot of fracture in the last 15 years or so. And I think that's led to, the activist crowd almost liking infighting, I think more than our supporters and ordinary members do,
Right. No, absolutely. One of the other questions that came out of that, and I, when I listened to the audio of that leaked audio that I think went to the CBC. I don't understand who working for Jason Kenney would think it was a good idea to record what he was saying in a private conversation and then give it to the CBC of all people. What does that say about the Premier's office and sort of the loyalty towards the Premier that some people were speculating that maybe it was all planned and that it wasn't a candid conversation, that he was doing it on purpose, but maybe you can shed some light onto how that happened, if there's any idea of who did it and what were they thinking basically.
Yeah, no, I can't imagine, especially in this year, any principled conservative leaking that sort of stuff to the CBC, and look, I think governments governments nowadays, they employ hundreds of people within an internal government to make sure it runs properly. Just like any business, you never kind of strike 100% in hiring that number of people. And sometimes there are individuals that are frustrated. I'm disappointed that I think any individual, and I've had this privilege, it's a privilege to work in this movement. It's a privilege to work in this province. It's disappointing that any individual would think, leaking an internal conversation to the CBC would be a good thing. But but I had to laugh too. People were acting like, oh, this was some Kenney chess move because he wanted that out there. Just meaning like what he's saying behind the scenes isn't, that unnormal for, I think regular conservative talk and, regular what I think conservatives are joining together and fight for. So it was unique, and I think obviously that came from one person disgruntled, but in a government where you're hiring hundreds, it's sometimes too bad. What I would say is, and I think True North put an awesome culture together, but for individuals who want to work in politics, like I think there's an awesome opportunity in this movement in politics. And I would recommend you to recommend to your family members, to yourself, like if you want to be involved in politics, I would say that the bar isn't sometimes as high as some people expect. And like we need more good people elected, we need more good people working for government too. So hopefully some people will hear that, and maybe even our culture of kind of internal staff will improve over the years.
Yeah, no, it's always hard to find good people. But, I lived in Alberta for several years during university and afterwards. And, from someone who's a total outsider, politics can seem really like an insider's game and almost intimidating. But I always found that the political culture in the conservative movement in Alberta was so welcoming. Like, you just show up to one event and 10 people introduce themselves to you, and, people invite you back to events. And there really is a great culture that's very inclusive and inviting to outsiders, and so it's really a big family of conservatives in Alberta, and that's one of the best parts. Just on a final note here, Brad, I have to ask you about this because I've seen a couple of recent polls in Alberta that indicate that the NDP are ahead. I've seen one poll that shows them like up 15 points. Another poll though that shows the Conservatives up. So what do you make of these polls? Do you think they're accurate? Do you think that the Conservatives should be afraid on a broader level? I know there's an election coming up, a general election coming up in May 2023. Do you think Conservatives should be worried about their chances against an NDP party and the potential of an NDP government again in Alberta?
Totally. Well, conservatives should never take anything for granted, right? Like we need to work hard. We need to prove that, there's the reason we will continue to be elected is the reason, is quite simply because we're the better party. We're more representative of Albertans. So you can never take that for granted. You got to go forward with that attitude. The recent polling. So I think during the height of COVID, like Jason was essentially taking it from both ends, and his polling went down. Like I saw the recent. There was one polling company from a firm, and I can say this because I've worked internally in Alberta politics. Like some firms here, they do online samples, and their data is usually garbage. Like some were putting like Trudeau right up with the federal Conservative Party last election in Alberta, and obviously it didn't come close to that. The two polls I watched most closely, I believe there was a syndicate from Janet Brown and a syndicate from Yorkville, both of which came out. Those both gave the UCP leads 4% and 5% respectively, because the Conservatives are stronger in Calgary and rural and weaker in Edmonton. That would work out to a pretty big win for him. Now, I think, look, last election, Jason Kenney won with 55% of the vote. That's a massive victory in Alberta politics. Like that's larger than Ralph or Peter Lougheed's like first victory. It's a very massive win. So a high bar to keep up. And I don't think he's a guy that'll be content at all with a 4 to 5 point win. We've got to continue to do better, which I think Alberta really, the UCP has a team in place, despite us sometimes being more dramatic than I think the ordinary voter might like. A team to rebound out of COVID. A lot is going well, and a lot's going well in the economy. A lot of, I think, what Jason Kenney and the initial UCP got elected to do is coming to fruition now, and that's great. And I think too, like some of these same polls were giving Rachel Notley and the NDP a 20-point lead like 4 or 5 months ago. So you don't see it in the mainstream media at all, but like it's also a story that I think any conservative that blew a 20-point lead in 5 months would be all over the news. Rachel Notley blew a 20-point lead and, is continuing down the same path of really the same style of opposition. So I think there's some reasons to be optimistic, but there's nothing bigger that should be a priority than work hard, make sure you're out there representing your voters, which I am happy to see that I think the UCP is kind of getting back to out of COVID,
Yeah, listen to the Grassroots, listen to the base, and the whole leadership review is exactly that. I remember I was out in Alberta in 2019 for the UCP convention, and at the time, the media and the narrative in the headlines was so anti-Kenney. It was like there was some revolt of nursing, the nursing union, and the economy. That the price of oil was really, really low, and everyone was talking about how the party was turning on Jason Kenney. And, I walked into the main room and Jason got, an overwhelming standing ovation that was like extended on and on. And the room was going crazy. They were absolutely elated to see him. And it couldn't have been a starker difference, Brad, between, the stories that we were told and the understanding that you would get from following the legacy media versus being in the room and seeing like, okay, this is an incredibly popular premier that has the full support of his party, despite the grumblings that you may hear. So I don't think it's a good idea to write off Jason Kenney. I think that he's come from behind so many times. So I really appreciate your time today and helping us kind of get a better perspective that you definitely won't see in the legacy media, because they definitely have an agenda to push one way, and when it comes to the opposition as well, the very disgruntled people are sometimes the loudest. So I appreciate your time. Thanks, Brad, for joining us.
Yeah, thank you very much, Candice.
All right, that is Brad Tennant. I'm Candice Malcolm, and this is the Candice Malcolm Show.